Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing today? I'm meteorologist Max Saparis over at WKOW. We're proud sponsors with Clean Lakes Alliance for these science cafes. Yes, Clean Lakes 101 science cafes. And as we get the program started today, some housekeeping notes. If you do have questions for our speakers, feel free to use the Q&A response tab at the bottom of the screen. You see that next to the chat. I'll be looking at the chat window and the Q&A response, but focus on that Q&A window, type in your questions, and then after our presenters speak, we will have as many questions as we can take. And of course, if we don't get to them all, we can email them to info@cleanlakesalliance.org, and we can follow up with them after we have our chat. So a lot of people wondering how they can personally help out with the lakes. That was a lot of the questions we got last time around for this Clean Lakes 101 Science Cafe. So this is the talk for you. It's titled At Home Water Quality Action, and looking exactly at what folks can do at home and how they can reduce stormwater runoff into the lake. Now, of course, stormwater carries those cyanobacteria causing phosphorus with it. So the more stormwater we can hold on the land, the less potential beach closures we can get in the summer due to those blue-green algae blooms. So presenting today's topic will be Dr. Katie Richgels. Richgels has a PhD in both ecology and in evolution. Rigels studied aquatic ecosystems and amphibian malformations for her thesis, and now manages a team of scientists who investigate wildlife disease outbreaks for a federal agency. Rigels is currently the chief of the Ecology and Epidemiology branch at the National Wildlife Health Center at the USGS. Epidemiology on top of a lot of our minds here the past couple of years. And we'll gather those questions that you have for Dr. Rigels coming up here after she talks. And before we get to the talk, I would like to introduce us to Courtney Seals. She's from the Johnson Financial Group to tell us about our sponsors and how you can get involved with the Clean Lakes Alliance. Good morning.
Thank you, Max. Before I hand things over to Dr. Rigels for today's talk, I wanted to thank the sponsors that make Clean Lakes 101 Science Cafe possible. Along with First Weber, Johnson Financial Group is proud to be the presenting sponsor of these talks. Our supporting sponsor is the National Guardian Life Insurance Company. Our usual hosting sponsor is the Edgewater. Hopefully we'll be able to be back in person soon. And our production partners are the University of Wisconsin-Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies and the UW Extension. I also want to thank everyone who has renewed their individual friend or their business lake partner donations this year. Thanks to you, we are extremely close to our annual campaign goal. If you have not yet renewed or you'd like to become a first-time friend or lake partner to support lake projects, educational programs like this one, and our volunteer mentoring program, visit cleanlakesalliance.org/donate. On the screen now is the list of partners, lake partners who have either joined or renewed in the past month. Thank you all. Back to today. As Max mentioned, the title of our talk is At Home Water Quality Action. I am very excited to hand things over to Dr. Katie Richgels to give us the information on how we can all work together to make our lakes cleaner and healthier. Take it away, Katie.
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. I'm gonna just take a second to share my screen here. And let's present that. Okay, so thank you so much for the really kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here today. I have been a member of, a friend of Clean Lakes Alliance for a couple of years and come to the Science Cafes most months. So it's been really fun to be invited to talk. And as Max said, we are talking about collective action that can help reduce stormwater impacts. So what we're going to cover today, I'll start with a really short introduction. I'm not going to cover as much of the background science as I often do when I give talks like this to the public, because this group, we've had so many great science talks about the ecology of the lakes that I feel like I'm just going to give you some reminders of those. And then we're going to spend most of our time talking about collective actions that we can do, different techniques. And I'm not going to go into depth about how you do each particular one, but I'm going to kind of instead cover a slew of them and encourage. And then after the talk, Luke has some resources he'll send out to attendees so you can explore some of these topics more in depth later if you'd like. First, I want to give myself an introduction. So my name is Katie Richgels. I did my PhD at the University of Colorado at Boulder, studying lake ecology and amphibian malformation. So that's both aquatic ecology and lake ecology, as well as wildlife disease. I did my undergrad at the University of Wisconsin Wildlife and Ecology Department. So I am no stranger to the campus. But these days I do work at the US Geological Survey. My current area is wildlife disease. And so this talk is me. I'm doing this on my own time as a volunteer because I just love lakes and I love that we live by lakes. And in particular, I got into some of these topics about learning about at-home water mitigation because I'm an ecologist with a water problem. We bought our lovely house in 2014 in Fitchburg, quickly realized we had some drainage problems, saw massive amounts of runoff from our neighbors are uphill of us, and the water flows all down past our house into the street. And as an ecologist who studies lakes, I knew that was a problem, but we also then in the spring of 2019, as we've been slowly mitigating this problem, we had a couple feet of snow, a couple inches of rain on top of it, the ground was still frozen, and our basement flooded. So for the last 2 years, I would say we've been all in on trying to mitigate the water in our own yard, both for the ecology, trying to use best practices and for the ecology, but also for obviously our house and the value of our house. But I know that Madison is no stranger to flooding. And so I wanted to give this sort of personal touch to know that like most of the things I'm going to talk about today, I've tried. So a lot of the tips I'm giving you are my own personal opinions. They're not necessarily any fancy science or anything. They're just, I've tried them. And this is sort of what I'm finding. So I want to just give a brief overview. We're talking about the Yahar watershed today. Everyone on this conversation should be familiar with that. It's 62 miles of river, 5 major lakes: Mendota, Monona, Wingrat, Wabeesa, and Kaganza. It covers 3 counties: Columbia, Dane, and Rock. But as you can see from this image, the majority is in Dane County. And so this is a local watershed, and it's the one that we play in and drive by and live with every day. It's also a really high human impacted area. So you can see here in the land use of the Yahar watershed, the yellow and orange is agriculture, the pink and red is urban development. This watershed is highly impacted by people. We have to live here too, but there are things we can do to mitigate our impacts and to try to be a better steward of our own resources. So we'll go into a little bit of the background now. So why are we capturing stormwater? You're gonna see pictures throughout that are of my own yard, because like I said, we've been through this venture together with my family. And so you will see this is actually flooding and runoff that happened from my own yard around that 2019 flood when we were trying to figure out what was happening there. And I want to remind everyone, so what we had happen in 2019 had to do with frozen ground. We have thick clay soil, so when the ground is frozen, the water does not go down. And that's part of what caused it to come up in our basement. But as you guys probably remember, in August of 2018, we had a massive storm that dropped 12 to 18 inches on the western side of Madison and caused a lot of flash flooding throughout the Madison area and Dane County area, with Cross Plains and Middleton being the most heavily affected. These types of storms are becoming more common, and one of the reasons we really want to mitigate stormwater on our own properties as much as we can is because it helps reduce what goes into the streets. In particular, our storm waters is how we move water, excess water, off the landscape in urban areas to the lakes. And storm waters, we have 2 sewer systems. There's the sewer system that you think of as your sanitary sewer that all the water in your house is connected to, and that obviously goes to a treatment plant and gets dealt with there. But then there are sanitary sewers, which are really just catch basins. So the water goes through the storm sewer grates into the piping under the streets, which actually pipe directly to the lakes. So anything that goes in the storm sewer, you can think of as like it's on the highway to the lake, it's going. And also those storm sewers have limited capacity. So the pipes are only so big. So if we get a huge storm and there's a lot of runoff, they quickly overflow. And that's when we get the urban flash flooding where our intersections flood. That 2018 flood did take I think at least 1 life. And that's always terrible and sad when that happens, right? And we want to be careful about trying to capture as much of that stormwater on our own property so it doesn't run into the street and overwhelm the storm sewers. And we're helping not just ourselves and our property, but also all of our neighbors, right? And so you're going to see these, I have a couple of terms here you're going to see me use, which are more scientific terms, which is we tend to call things like concrete and blacktop things that water can't run through as impervious or impermeable surfaces. You'll hear me use both of those terms. And then things that water can flow through are considered permeable or pervious surfaces. So you'll hear me say that as well. And as I said, climate change is exacerbating this issue. We have strengthening storms that are increasing the frequency of our high precipitation events. That storm from 2018 would normally be a really rare event. And Max, I'm a meteorologist, probably can tell you more about that, but it's gonna likely become more common. And we need to prepare for the advent of sort of more high frequency, high precipitation events. Okay, so this is just a little diagram showing the differences in a highly urbanized with lots of impervious surfaces versus a nice green space where everything is pervious. You see that the main difference here is looking at what they're calling infiltration. So infiltration is the rate at which water works its way through the soil into the groundwater. And it's usually measured in inches per hour. So you can see here, when we have a green space, about 50% of all the water that falls is going down into the soil. You have 40% coming off as evapotranspiration. That's both evaporation and transpiration by the plants. The plants also have a way to draw water up as part of their the way that they breathe, that also uses water and can use water quickly in the case of a storm. If it's been a drought and it rains, the plants are like little sponges, right? They just want to pull up as much water as they can. So that leaves only 10% that runs off in green areas. However, in an urbanized area where we have a lot of concrete, you see a very different pattern. We have very little that infiltrates because we have so many surfaces that water can't go down through. So only 15% in this diagram. And you end up with 55% runoff, and you have less evapotranspiration because you're missing the component that the plants add to that, right? So you have evaporation, but there's not really a lot of transpiration because no plants. So you see a huge proportion running off over the surface as opposed to infiltrating. And we really want, part of the reason for this, so I'm explaining this pattern, right? Part of why we see green spaces having good infiltration is that plants help water infiltrate. So not only do you have to have exposed soil, right? Or plants covering the soil, but have the soil not be covered by like concrete, right? That helps. But plants also help absorb water because they both absorb it themselves and their roots make pockets in the soil that the water can follow. And I want to just point out, this is a study from, I don't have very many complicated graphs, but bear with me on this one. This is a study from USGS, not myself. Like I said, I do this in volunteer capacity when I think about lakes, but we have a great water science center in Middleton that does a lot of work on a lot of applied questions around water management. And in 2010, they published a study looking at rain garden design, and they had sandy soils and clay soils. So the graphs on the left are sandy soils, the graphs on the right are clay soils. And then they compared just grass to a native planting in that sort of in that rain garden. And what they found is that infiltration rates really mattered. So what you see is with natives, you get higher infiltration rates, and they get higher through time. So you can see this sort of positive trend in both. Obviously, sandy soils have higher infiltration than clay soils, even in the absence of plants, right? But you do see an improvement in both cases by using native plants. And the reason for this is that native plants are adapted to our climate. They have long, deep roots because we have seasonal rains. So we get a lot of spring rain. We have a period in August and September where we tend not to get hardly any rain, right? And that dry period, our plants are adapted for that dryness. They're adapted for heavy rains in the spring and lesser rains in the late summer and fall. And so they grow really long roots that can touch the groundwater, right? So they can get water when there's drought. Turf grass, on the other hand, is that, see the yellow bar in the middle of this figure? I know it might be a little bit blurry, but that's grass and grass roots. And you can see they're only a few inches, right? Maybe 6 inches at best. And so they're not really contributing to your ability to infiltrate your soil. Your regular, so this is Kentucky bluegrass, I believe it's turf grass. There are other grasses that have longer roots and other ways to make your grass better infiltrators. But just know our native plants, any planting really that's going to have a deep root system is going to be better than grass when it comes to infiltration. So in summary, you really want to encourage infiltration to reduce flooding. These are more images from my own yard. I have a new rain garden on the right that still holds water pretty regularly because it's still, it takes time for the roots to grow deep down and to help it infiltrate. So we have thick clay soil. So we have kind of a bit of retention pond for now. And I'm showing on the left my Friends of Clean Lakes Alliance sign that I keep in my yard. Make sure all my neighbors know. The other reason that we want to reduce runoff is to reduce pollution. We all are aware of the fact that we sometimes have to close our beaches on our local lakes for high bacteria and also for algae blooms, right? So we get these big toxic algae blooms. I'm not going to go through the N and P cycles as much as I normally would, but just know that nitrogen and phosphorus come from lots of sources, including urban runoff. So in stormwater, there's a lot of different types of pollution that can be present. This is a really nice figure that just sort of lays it all out. But basically, water runs off your roof, runs off your driveway, runs off your sidewalks. And while it does that, it picks things up like pet waste, leaves, fertilizers, motor oils, detergents, all those things, and they go down the storm sewer. So that's not good. And then we are going to talk about nitrogen and phosphorus today and reducing fertilizer use, but I want to acknowledge what we all probably know, which is that agriculture is the largest contributor to nitrogen and phosphorus to our lakes. This is a series of studies that was done by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and they looked at some point source and totals coming from different places for both nitrogen and phosphorus. And for both cases, about 70% of our nitrogen and phosphorus loading in the lakes in Minnesota. And I don't know how much you know about the Twin Cities, but it's very similar to us besides just being bigger, but they have lots of urban lakes. So they were measuring runoff to their urban lakes that run through the Twin Cities area. And so I think this is not exactly what we'll see in Madison, but it's pretty close. And I think the pattern would hold that you'd get about the same percentage. But I want to also point out that phosphorus in particular has a large urban source. About 30% of all the phosphorus in this study was from urban sources. And actually a lot of that comes from leaves. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But nitrogen also has some runoff. Municipal wastewater can hold nitrogen, especially if it's picking up pet waste on the way. That tends to be very high in nitrogen. And as we know, nutrient runoff causes eutrophication of our lakes, which leads to the sort of the system of harmful algal blooms, where we have high nutrients, warm still waters that create blooms. And I just like to remind people here that eutrophication is actually a natural process. So all lakes go from sort of clear bottomed, deep, cool, rocky bottomed, low nutrient, which we call oligotrophic in lake ecology, to very eutrophic, which is very green, shallow, warm. And that happens over time as the lake slowly fills in with sediment from the land. This usually takes millennia, but humans have really increased the rate at which eutrophication is happening. Eutrophication is very hard to reverse, as we've learned in other talks, right? So you really want to try to limit as much excess phosphorus and nitrogen that goes into lakes as you can, because this process is very hard to reverse. Once you're there, it's going to be really hard to stop the algae blooms from happening, but if we can reduce inputs, we won't make it any worse. And there are some programs like Dane County is doing a Suck Them Up program where they are trying to pull up phosphorus and nitrogen heavy sediments and pull them out of the lakes. That I'm really looking forward to seeing how that goes and how much they're able to pull, because I think that is one of the few ways in which you can reverse this pattern, but it's very expensive and time consuming. Better prevention is always going to be better when it comes to this. Oh, and I forgot I love this quote, which actually comes from Clean Lakes Alliance, which says, just 1 pound of pee can create 500 pounds of wet algae. So one of the reasons why we really want to encourage water to soak in through our own properties, our own lawns and our green spaces, public property, doesn't really matter. The reason we want to keep it out of the streets and the storm sewers is that soil has a nice cleaning property. Each soil layer, they're layered through the earth. They each have a different pore size and chemical composition. So nutrients are filtered out of the soil as water flows down into our groundwater aquifers. And also plants will grab them. And if they're short on something, it comes in the rainwater, they're going to pull that right out, right? So the process of sort of filtering through the soil is really a filtering process. And the water that goes into the groundwater is clean, mostly clean. It replenishes our drinking water. It can replenish lakes through springs and other subsurface trades, right? So infiltrating the water into the groundwater is the best way to naturally clean it, to get that ecosystem services without having to do any extra work. So to reduce our pollution that goes into the sewers, we want to have our landscape be a green filter instead of a gray funnel. Okay, so that's the really short introduction of some of the background science. And if you have questions about it, please feel free to throw them in the Q&A. Max and I can tackle answering them after the talk. But now I'm going to really get into the list of potential collective actions, and I'm going to focus on things you might do to try to capture stormwater on your property. They are aimed a little bit at homeowners, but I have some tips for even those who aren't. And then the second subset will be about things you can do to reduce pollution. And some of them are the same, so you'll see some similar tips. Okay, so again, this is my own yard, things I've done in my own yard. I have an elbow extension, I have rain gardens. So the very first one, I like to start with sort of the easiest, is to redirect stormwater. Aim your downspouts away from impervious surfaces. Don't let that drain go out onto your driveway and run down your driveway. Put it into your lawn. You add an elbow, an extension. You can also add something called a catch basin, which is just a container that you bury in the ground, basically, for water to hold and infiltrate from the bottom of the catch basin. These materials are available at home improvement stores, and they're pretty easy and low cost. If you're having water problems at your yard in any way, this is going to be the first thing you find as far as recommendations to try. After that, if that doesn't work to get water away from your home and get it infiltrating, there are a couple other things you can try. This French drain is a little bit more complicated. Often you can do it yourself. We have done that. It's a lot of work, but it's doable. If you're into DIY projects, you can do it for about $500, or you can ask a landscaping contractor to do it for a couple thousand, which is fairly expensive. So just keep your note. But one of the nice things about it is it helps you move water underground to a low area where it can infiltrate. And so you often see French drains installed so you have your drain spouts coming from the roof that are attached to the French drain underwater, and the French drain runs to a rain garden or other retention pond. And that can move the water away from your foundation where you don't want it and into a low spot in your yard where it can infiltrate over time. So these are fairly simple. They're a plastic tube with perforations at the bottom, surrounded by gravel, surrounded by landscaping cloth, or you can buy, like the picture in the bottom left is an image of an already bought one. So you can buy them already sort of packed with gravel and with their landscape cloth, and you just have to put in your trench. So these are pretty simple if you're only putting in a small one. If you have to put in a lot, you may want to talk to a landscaper about that. You do have to make sure you get the grading right, or else they won't work properly. So they have to be graded downhill, slowly downhill to your low-lying area. The other option within this group is you can capture stormwater. You can actually hold stormwater. In some parts of the US, that's actually a little bit, the legality of that's questionable, but here in Wisconsin, we don't have any rules about the capturing of stormwater. And so you can install rain barrels to capture water that comes with the rain and use during dry periods on your own gardens. We have, I think, 4 rain barrels at our house. We connect these to our gutters, as you can see sort of in this picture. And then we hold water, and then in dry periods, we use the water to water our gardens. One thing to be aware of is if you're going to catch water off your roof and it's an asphalt roof, you do not want to use that to water food gardens, because the asphalt, there's chemicals that leach out of the asphalt that you don't want to eat. These have medium costs. You can again buy them at home improvement stores, or there's a link to Rain Reserve in the materials you'll get. And those can be purchased on their website, or they used to be part of a program with the Sustain Dane initiative, but I believe that that's not true anymore. But they're not too expensive, and they're also, oops, too many. They're not very hard to install, but you do have to do some maintenance on rain barrels. You can't leave them connected over winter. They do freeze and crack. So you want to sort of drain them and disconnect them and then reconnect them in the spring. The other thing you need to be careful of is that rain barrels sometimes have open lids. And you do not want to make mosquito breeding grounds. So we use a natural control called BTI. It's a native bacteria that will kill mosquito larvae, and they just come in little wafers that are really easy to use. You just break them off and stick them in, and that'll keep mosquitoes down if you are going to use these. A couple of tips we learned the hard way is that water that comes out of a rain barrel runs downhill, right? It's all gravity driven. So you either need to raise it up, buy a pump, or place it on high ground if you want the water to flow at any normal rate. Again, don't use roof water to water food gardens. And the other thing that we learned the hard way is make sure you have an overflow mechanism. When we got our 12 inches of rain, our rain barrels were connected and they overflowed. And the last thing you want is overflowing water right at your foundation of your house. So as you can see in this picture, there's a little white spigot. You can attach a runoff hose to that and just have it out away from your house. We actually disconnect them, but connect them when we know there's heavy rains coming. But you could also just leave them installed if you don't mind. Okay, so then from there, the next thing you can think about is reducing the amount of impervious surfaces you have in your yard. So if you're planning to put in a patio or replace aging cement, think about alternatives that would be more pervious to water. And there's some really cool new technology called Pervious pavers. That's a type of concrete that has a really loose set. So water actually flows through it. It's really cool if you ever see it. You can pour water on it and just I think it's a little bit more expensive, but you can find it at home improvement stores. And there's also some other types of pavers that are becoming popular, like the diamond pattern there where you have grass in between, or do a flagstone path that has gaps. We at our house have a crushed gravel path that's not, that is pervious to water, but works just as well as concrete. So there are options to think about, other ways in which to have paths and sort of pervious surfaces in replacement of what would normally be concrete. And then probably my favorite way, because I also love, I'm an ecologist and I love plants. My favorite way to capture stormwater is through rain gardens. And so these are shallow depressions planted with native flowering plants and shrubs. They're tolerant to flooding and drought. Remember, I talked about how we get really wet springs and really sort of dry late summer and early August. So a lot of our native plants are actually quite used to wet, soggy conditions, especially those that grow on the edges of our marshes. So there's a set of plants that are usually recommended for rain gardens. That will help capture runoff and make this nice space for infiltration. They also provide habitat to pollinators and can make a really pollinator-friendly lawn. And I think they're really beautiful, but they do tend to have a pretty natural look, so you have to be ready for that. Some design considerations for rain gardens are that you want a shallow depression. You want it to be in a spot that's logical, right? So look at where your water is going and find a place where you can capture it along that path. And you want to direct your downspouts and stuff to your rain garden. These are not retention ponds. You're not digging a big ditch. You want them to be 6 to 12 inches below the grass. We have deep clay soil at our house, so ours are more like 18 inches, but you don't want them to hold water for long periods. That will kill most of the plants. If they hold water for months, they're not used to that. They can hold water for a few days as it slowly infiltrates. That's kind of what you're looking for. If you are going to put them on a slope, make sure you add a berm so that you terrace the downhill side so it actually holds water. And the nice thing about rain gardens, especially for using native plants, is you don't actually need that much amending of the soil. As far as horticulture goes, like ornamental plants in your yard, native plants in rain gardens are actually really easy to care for. Once they're planted, those perennials are hardy. They tend to come back every year. You don't need to worry about fertilizing them. You only really need to water them in their first year. They're pretty easy. One thing that I think people often easily get overwhelmed by in rain garden planning is there's a lot of guidance out there about calculating the size of the rain garden you need for the amount of water that comes off your roof. This is really only important if you care about catching all your stormwater. If you're trying to, engineer the perfect stormwater capture so that you have no runoff ever, this matters. If all you're trying to do is make an improvement with the space you have, pick the size you have. There's a really good fact sheet called Downspout Gardens by Ripple Effects, which is part of the Sustain Dane initiative. That is a really nice fact sheet for talking about how to just put them where you have space for them. We have several rain gardens at our house. Neither one of them is big enough to capture all the runoff from my roof, but they help, right? I'm slowing down in lower, lighter rains. I'm catching most of it. In really heavy rains, obviously some still runs off, but I'm doing the best I can, and it's all the space I had. My side yard's not that wide. I could only make so big of a rain garden. So I would encourage you not to stress about if you can't make it big enough. Any amount of native plantings or native gardens where your water is flowing will help. So when it comes to choosing rain garden plants, this is typical gardening recommendations. You want to think about planning the locations. Look at how much sun is there, what type of soil you have. You want to select plants that are going to tolerate that frequent wetting and having kind of wet feet. And then you want to plant them in clumps. They usually do a little bit better packed together. And this is more of a gardening tip, but select plants that bloom across different seasons of the year. So let's say I'm going to pick 6 plants. I might have 2 that bloom in spring, 2 that bloom in summer, and 2 that bloom in fall. That way I have food for pollinators for the whole duration of the growing period, as well as nice blooms at all times in my garden. I want to take a moment here to talk a little bit about native plants. They can be quite confusing. I get a lot of questions from my friends and family. I'm a pretty avid native gardener, as well as just gardener in general. And I get a lot of questions from my friends and family about, like, how do I know that I'm buying a native? How do I know if it's a good native? Those types of questions. And natives, there's 2 things to look for. There are native only plant nurseries and native plant sales, which I'll give some resources for in a minute. But you can also often find native cultivars at just your local nursery. And there's a little bit of a difference between the 2, but I think they're both beneficial. So I'm not telling you to do one or the other, but they have some pros and cons. So natives are going to come directly from native stock. No breeding change in their properties or genetics are going to match what occurs in the wild. These are beautiful to have in your yard, but they do provide a very native look. So you're going to have browning of the lower leaves. They're not as showy. They won't bloom as long, right? Native cultivars are native species, that we've brought into cultivation as humans and made them a little bit showier and better garden. They tend to be prettier, longer blooms, maybe don't brown as much, you know, so they tend to look a little nicer. There is some research that shows that cultivars have less benefit for pollinators. I wouldn't say they have no benefit, because pollinators can still use them, but they're not as nutritious as the native would be, because by breeding them to be showier and to bloom longer, they have to save their resources and they can't have as sweet of nectar, basically, is the science behind there. I would say, so this picture is actually from my own garden. The species on the left is Black-Eyed Susan. The species on the right is also Black-Eyed Susan. But the one on the left is a native from a native nursery from native stock. And the one on the right is something called a Gloriosa daisy that my grandmother gave to me. And it is a cultivar that's quite common and quite popular. But you can see that the difference between these two plants isn't that big. I'd say one of the biggest differences is that Gloriosa daisies will continue to bloom through the season, whereas my Black-Eyed Susans tend to bloom, they actually bloom for a long period, but each plant blooms at a slightly different time. So I often have them in my garden, but I don't have a big patch that's all blooming together and continues to bloom together. Whereas the Gloriosa daisies have a little bit longer of a blooming period. So it's just an example of native cultivars versus natives. And again, anything you do is going to help. So if you really like to have a nice cultured looking garden, so you're like, I don't know if I can do a native garden, it's not my style, think about a native cultivar. We have quite a lot of natives that have been cultivated over the years, and they can be very beautiful. Again, I get a lot of questions about where to buy native plants, how to know if you're buying a native plant. The easiest, in my opinion, is to use our local nonprofit initiatives. So Plant Dane and Friends of the Arboretum both have plant sales in the spring. Friends of Arboretum is usually around Mother's Day. Plant Dane is usually in June. Both of these you can often order online. You can go the day of and browse. They have volunteers who really know what they're talking about, who can help you pick out plants and have an idea if we're getting the right thing. They have really nice information about their plants that tell you sort of location and sun and how big it gets and who it likes to live with, right? What other plants are good companion plants. So I definitely encourage you to look at those resources. That's definitely how I got into native plantings. There are also 2 commercial native plant nurseries in the area. Agricole is in Oregon. Two Ferns, I believe, is on the west side of Madison near Middleton. Both sell native plants exclusively. Agricole is more of a online ordering, so you can order in bulk. Let's say you're going to put in a prairie restoration on your property and you need a whole big flat of prairie plants. They sell these big mixes that come. And I'd actually tell you that for most, you can find these types of mixes just on the internet if you want native plants for Wisconsin. And they'll sell you a rain garden kit for sunny sites and sandy soils, and a rain garden kit for partial sun and clay soil. So you can kind of optimize if you don't want to worry about learning all the names and all the whatever. You can actually buy kits and they're quite helpful. Finally, if you're looking for cultivars in particular, you can find them at our local nurseries. So Jung's and Bruce Company both sell some natives, and I've had some success just going there with a list of some of the ones I'm looking for and asking them when I get there, and they help walk me through. I would say you definitely want to probably bring a list of the natives you're looking for to the bigger nurseries, because they often have plants of the same genus, but they might be a species from Asia. And so it's important to know sort of the species name of what you're looking for. That way, the person who's there helping you, who may or may not be as knowledgeable about natives, can really help you determine if you're buying the right thing. And lastly, once you've got your rain garden plants in, the last thing you do is you mulch it. This is our rain garden before the big flood, as I like to call it, where this is the initial installation. This is the one my husband and I did ourselves. We were very proud of it. You need to do some weeding. You need to water it, especially in the first year. After that first year, you won't need to water it, but you do need to be patient. It takes time for native perennials to become established, often a couple of seasons. So know that the first years or two, it might look a little scraggly, but it's going to eventually fill in beautifully. And I wanted to highlight City of Madison Rain Garden Initiative. They have an initiative of 1,000 rain gardens in the Madison area. I have not added my dots to this map, but I'm going to after this talk. So you can email, if you go to the City of Madison, their engineering department, and look at their city rain gardens, they have a way to report where you have rain gardens, and then they add your dot to the map. And their goal is to try to get to 1,000 rain gardens. So if you are going to build some or you have some, feel free to join that initiative. I think that's pretty fun. So in summary of ways to capture stormwater, redirect your downspouts, install rain barrels, use pervious surfaces, plant rain gardens. And the optimal solution is going to be a combination of several of these. You can find sort of what works for you. There's no do all of them if you want to mitigate stormwater. No, figure out what works for you. If you have really sandy soil, you may not need to do very many of these. I have thick clay soil. So this is actually this is the same rain garden from the previous picture, but now this is the enlarged version after we had to redo a bunch of the grading at our house. And you can see we have a crushed gravel path going to our back door. That's a pervious surface. I have a swale with a French drain that's connected to my downspouts that comes out at the rain garden. And then I also have a rain barrel in the back there that's disconnected because this was taken in the spring. But we also capture water from the rain barrels that actually use to water the rain garden during drought. So we just run a soaker hose from it basically and run it through the rain garden, and then it slowly drips out. So we have used a lot of these at our house, and you can combine multiples to figure out sort of what's going to work for you in your property. Okay, so moving on from that, we're going to talk a little bit about reducing pollution and runoff. So we can't capture all the water. That's why we go here, right? So you want to, but in really heavy rains, even in my own yard, our side yards are very narrow, so the amount of space I have to capture water isn't that big, so my rain gardens overflow. And so what you really want to do is think about ways to keep what's flowing off your property low in nutrients. So limit what goes in the storm sewer is one of the easiest things you can do, and anyone can do this. You don't have to be a homeowner. If you rent, this works for you too. Don't put anything down the storm drains that isn't pure water. Clean up any spills that are happening in your driveway, on your sidewalks, and the road as soon as you can. You can sweep instead of washing your concrete, then you're not washing all that dirt that can be high in nutrients into the storm drains. Wash your cars away from drains. Soap that goes into drains is a contaminant for lakes. You really try to keep soap out of them. So you can, if you need to clean your car, if you're really into having a shiny, perfect car, clean it on your grass, where the soap can break down naturally in the soil and won't get washed off into the drain. Or you can do what I do, which is have your little kids use a lot of elbow grease. So we just use water and they scrub the car and it comes out really clean. And that's a great way to make sure that you're not really adding any soap to the lakes. In addition, you can use sand instead of salt. Probably a lot of you are familiar with Wisconsin's Saltwise initiative, but we are having rising salinity in a lot of our lakes due to the amount of salt we use on roads and our driveways and sidewalks. So sometimes I know salt has to be used. We get those bad freezes and you have this black ice on the corner and like you just got to do something because someone's going to hurt themselves. That's okay. But where you can, try to use less salt and use sand for traction instead. We definitely do this on our driveway. We lay down sand for our cars. And then if we have to use salt, we just use it on the sidewalks if in spots where we're worried about somebody falling. Another really great way to reduce nutrients, regardless of whether you own a home or not, is to pick up after your pet. So pet waste is really high in nitrogen and phosphorus. So you don't want to let the pet waste just be. It makes pretty good fertilizer for non-food gardens. So one of the things I know we do, this is my dog Bandit on the right there. She's in here with me today laying on the floor. But in our backyard, we have some low spots in the backyard where the water sits. And so we tend to pile, collect her feces and use it as fertilizer back there where we know the mulch and things is going to keep the nutrients in place and the plants are going to keep it there. If you can't do that, if you don't have a place to put it in your yard where it won't contaminate the water flowing out of your yard, you can also bag it up and put it in the trash. It'll go to the landfill and be dealt with there. And can be a way to reduce nutrient runoff. Definitely don't leave waste in common spaces. A lot of dogs pass through our parks and our walkways, and you don't want to leave it there because that is a place where you'll cause some contamination. You can also contaminate the lakes with E. coli with dog feces. So that's another reason why to try to pick up. Another thing you can do is cut back on fertilizers. And I have a picture of grass here, but a lot of people I know fertilize all of their gardens. If you're planting natives, you don't actually really need fertilizer, a little bit of mulch and compost every year, and they'll be happy as can be. But if you are going to fertilize, sometimes you have plants that need to. Like I love dahlias. They bloom better with a little bit of fertilizer. I get that. So if you're going to do that, watch the weather and avoid applying it in heavy rains. Know the life cycle of the plant that you're trying to fertilize so that you can optimize the application for when it's growing the most. A lot of plants need fertilizer at the beginning of the growing season, but they don't necessarily need it all summer long. It depends on the plant. So know and target your applications. I'd also say that if you can add a little bit, let's say you're doing some new spring plantings and you want to fertilize, instead of putting the fertilizer at the top of the soil, put it at the bottom of the hole and mix it in with the soil. That's a better way to fertilize. Then you know that fertilizer is going to be in the soil for that plant and it's not going to wash off. So do targeted applications. Try to be smarter about your fertilizer use. Oops, and I keep jumping way ahead. one of the things you can do actually for grass, if you don't want to fertilize your grass as much, is leave your grass cutting high. So if you mow your lawn at greater than 2.5 inches, you actually improve the grass health. And if you leave the clippings from every time you mow, you won't really need to fertilize as much because those clippings break down and go back into the soil as nutrients. The other thing you can do is plant hardier grasses. So there's a fescue. These are non-natives, but they're cold hardy, very tolerant to drought. They tend to do better in our climate, called fescues. And if you're like me, so this is a picture of my own yard on the right with our kids' play set, and you can see it's not perfect grass. If you really love perfect grass, that is okay. There are ways to manage that and still have that perfect American grass. If you're okay with a messier look, mixing in other species like clover, there's a lot of really good resources out there on pollinator-friendly yards, but also clover has deeper roots and adds nitrogen. It's a bean, so it's gonna fix nitrogen into the soil for your grass. So the co-mixing of the two actually can keep other weeds out, and it makes the bees really happy. They love clover. We have patches of clover and viola and all these blooming plants in our yard. If you can tolerate that, that's a really good solution to reduce fertilizer for lawns. But I also know that for some people that perfect lawn really matters, and that's okay. You can definitely do that too. Any organic mulch is going to add nutrients. So instead of using fertilizer, you can regularly mulch. It also keeps weeds down. So I think a lot of people do this anyway. And you can do anything from the picture on the far right. These are all from my own yard. Picture on the far right is our yard waste pile that we just pile in the fall, and it sort of becomes dirt over time, and then we respread it. We use straw on our food gardens over the winter to kind of insulate and keep them covered. And then we use bark mulch, under our trees and in our flower gardens just to keep the weeds down and to renew the soil. We talked a little bit about this actually in our little warm up, but that is leaves. Rake and mulch your leaves. One of our biggest sources of urban phosphorus is leaf litter, because the leaves pile up on the storm sewer and then all the water passes through them, and you're basically making leaf tea. And while leaves have turned brown and taken a lot of their nutrients out, a lot of the nitrogen and phosphorus remains, especially the phosphorus. So cleaning up your leaves and getting them off the street is actually a really, really, really important way of keeping nutrients out of the lakes. And there is in Madison and Dane County right now a leaf-free streets initiative. You should check it out. One of the things we love to do is actually use our leaf blower. We put it in reverse and we suck up all the leaves, and then we go to our garden bed and we put it in forward and we spit them all back out in the garden bed. And then they are the mulch for the winter for those garden beds. So the picture on the far right is our walking onion bed. You can see it's mulched with leaf litter. And that works great as far as keeping the leaf litter out of the streets, as well as keeping it, using it again, keeping the nutrient cycle local on my own property. And then you can also spread compost. Organic compost is as effective as fertilizer for adding nutrients back to the soil. So especially for vegetable gardens, a fresh layer of compost, maybe a little manure at the beginning of each season, and you pretty much don't need a lot of other fertilizers. There's lots of benefits to composting. It retains more water, it reduces soil erosion, it helps carbon sequestration, reduces landfill waste, and it reduces the need for fertilizers. And composting is actually really simple. You can do it at home. Basically what happens is you pile all your organic waste on, the microbes add heat, but as they break stuff down, and then you need to make sure it has water and air. And if it has all three of those things, heat, water, and air, it will become dirt. And the rate at which it becomes dirt has a little bit to do with how good you are at turning it to get air and keeping it moist. There's definitely some things oops, I think I went too far. So how to compost, you need a bin. I definitely would recommend a lid if you're in the urban areas, urban and suburban areas. You don't want pests like raccoons getting in. If you're putting any food waste in, a lid is really a must-have. Water it periodically, turn it periodically, and be patient. So our bins are the bottom two on the left, the two black ones. And what we do is we fill one year and we use out of the other, and then the next year we switch. So it takes about a year for a bin full of organic waste to turn into soil for us, because we're slow at watering and we're slow at turning. If you're better at those things, you can get black dirt in a couple of months. And there are some things you shouldn't do. Again, don't leave it open. You don't want pests. Don't put your pet waste in there, because it can have things like E. coli and other bacteria we do not want on our food. So don't put food waste in your compost, or pet waste in your compost. Don't put any plants that have gone to seed unless you want volunteers everywhere. Usually at-home compost, unlike commercial block compost, don't get warm enough to kill the seed banks. So anything that has seeds, Probably shouldn't go in unless you don't mind volunteers. We get squash volunteers from our fall pumpkins everywhere, but we sort of love it, so we let that happen, right? Don't add charcoal because it doesn't break down that well, and don't add meat or dairy. Again, meat and dairy is because of bacterial concerns, and also you're going to attract pests to your compost. Okay, so in summary, there's a lot of things we can do to reduce runoff pollution as well. Try to keep things clean out of the storm sewers. No dumping, you know, keep anything you're doing away from them if you can. Use sand instead of salt. Pick up after your dog. Keep your leaves out of your streets, and reduce your home nutrient use by planting with natives and targeting and optimizing your application, using mulch and compost, natural materials instead of artificial fertilizers. And then if you don't own a home, and a lot of these things are like, yeah, great, I can't do these, I want to really emphasize that there's other ways to participate in these efforts. You can support regulations and nonprofits. You can always get involved to help advocate for to help support those who are advocating for our lakes. I think both Ripple Effects and Sustain Dane, which are Dane County's big initiatives, as well as the city of Madison and a lot of the other smaller cities in the area, all have initiatives to try to help encourage better water retention and better nutrient retention on properties. And you can support that with your vote, with your money, with your time. I highly encourage you to think about any combination of those if you can, or if you're interested. And so this is my example from before. So this is my before is on the right with my big flooded side yard, and my after is on the left. This garden bed is only a couple years old, so it's still coming into its own, but we really capture a lot of the stormwater now that used to run through here with a big pollinator garden. So I have lots of native plants, a lot of big variety of things butterflies love. I have a swale that goes to a rain garden. And we haven't mitigated all the water. If we get really big rains, the rain garden overflows, but we capture a lot of it now, and we're getting a better infiltration rate than we were getting with my grass and clay soil before. So some key take homes for today: encourage stormwater to infiltrate to reduce flooding, reduce home nutrient use and keep debris out of the storm sewers to reduce pollution. Find a combination of actions that work best for you. Collective actions have big impacts because we all make incremental improvements, right? If we all capture just a little bit more together, we have a really big impact. So I encourage you to think about what that one thing will be. And I just want to say thank you so much for listening, and I'll pass it to Max to start our Q&A.
All right, well, excellent presentation, Dr. Rigels. Thanks for telling us all the things that as individuals, we can make a difference still, especially since we have those beautiful lakes we want to continue to maintain. So let's go ahead and get to some of these questions. Folks at the Clean Lakes Alliance can answer, but of course you're probably wanting Dr. Rigels to answer these questions for us. And it does look like we have a few. Hopefully we can get through all these before the seminar wraps up at 9 o'clock. A little bit of a different view. Again, we're talking a lot about residential impacts, but Jake asked about cropland, one of the primary sources for phosphorus in the Yahara watershed, according to him. So who is working with them and other ag groups to mitigate the effects on our lakes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd actually encourage you, there was a talk about 3 months ago that really talked about some initiatives that they're trying to do to reduce agricultural runoff. There are some programs, and I don't want to screw them up because this isn't my specialty, but I know there are some programs looking at better ways to fertilize farmland. So there are some initiatives to use there's these machines that can put liquid fertilizer under the soil, which really reduces runoff. Obviously, the use of things like buffers are really important. And we do have good monitoring at a couple of so USGS does have some monitoring stations in collaboration with the city and UW that measure the inputs. And you're right, we have a ton of runoff from agriculture. And I think there's a couple different programs. I know one of the talks now 2 months ago was talking about credits, and I'll be honest to say that it's not my area. I didn't follow the whole talk, but there is a bill up in legislation right now to try to better capture credits for groups who are doing good green practices in agricultural practices. And so there are some initiatives in that way as well. But again, not my specialty, so I'm going to apologize for sort of the vague answer, but there's definitely some movement there as well.
All right, thanks, Dr. Rigels. Well, another thing that we could get to is this question, going back to more about residential impacts. It comes from Ames, and they're wondering about driveway materials, so more of a bigger project than sort of the day-to-day minutia. So they want to replace their blacktop as it's deteriorating now, but other solutions or companies that can maintain the blacktop better, so we're not assuming that gets into the lakes as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are impervious systems you can use, but I'd say that they're not terribly popular yet. So you do see, especially if you don't have a very steep driveway, if you have a pretty flat driveway, you do see people use those diamond with grass in between as driveway replacements. And that's a pervious surface and can work really well. Again, if you have a really flat driveway and I don't know where you live. So if you're in the urban areas, gravel is probably not going to work. But if you're out of town a ways, a crushed gravel driveway does take some maintenance, but it is pervious to water, so that can be a benefit. As far as if you have to renew existing materials, I don't know the difference between like blacktop versus concrete as far as whether one would be preferable to the other. They're both, as far as from my ecologist standpoint, they're both impervious. And so you'll have to do a little research on that. I don't know for sure. There are some companies that in the Madison area, some landscapers, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but you can Google them, who specialize in sort of green design. I think they cost a little more, but if you're really, really passionate about that, I would encourage you to find one of those contracting companies that does green landscape design and see what they have to say about your driveway.
Interesting. Okay, well, thanks for that. Question here. Can we use native cultivators in our rain garden, or should we just stick with natives for better infiltration? Interesting.
Yeah, so for infiltration, the native cultivar and the native are going to be pretty similar. They are still the same species of plant, right? One's just been bred to be a little more pleasing to the human eye, right? So I would say, again, this is really more a matter of preference. I think if you're really passionate about like pollinators and having restoring native landscapes, then I'd say go with the native. But if you like to have a more cultivated lawn, and that's something that matters to you, but you want to have a rain garden, there's nothing wrong with using cultivars. There's nothing wrong with even necessarily mixing in some ornamentals here and there that are ones you like. The yard it's your yard, right? You have to enjoy it too. And so I think any plant is better than grass, regardless of whether it's ornamental or a native cultivar or a native. And so finding, you can find that balance that works for you. And I think all of them are good options.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, Dave asking, in a forested lake watershed like ours, what is best for limiting that runoff and any undergrowth? So again, I guess we're thinking really of natural limiting here.
Yeah, so having good plant growth, both understory and if you're talking about a forest, you want to have your intact understory. You see a lot of people who like to have a forest but clear the understory, and trees will help with infiltration, right? They have deep, big root systems, but it's a lot of times it's actually the understory that helps hold that can really help, because your trees are only every so often, right? So you end up with a lot of exposed soil. So you actually want to encourage and allow sort of an amount of understory growth and not control that as much. I think the more understory you're growing, the less ways that, like, if you have a bunch of leaves on the ground and soil, you're going to have less erosion, you're going to have less nutrient runoff. And the more plants you have in the space, the more root systems you have, the better your infiltration and the less runoff you're going to have. So I guess that's the way I would answer that.
All right, great. Well, Dan asks, can you share a marketing success story in communities where a specific approach was successful in getting to change behavior? So a bigger picture question.
That's a great question. And I wish as a scientist, I could answer that like, oh yeah, we know how to do this. No, this is hard. Change is hard. Changing people's minds are hard. And I don't know that it's a single marketing campaign. We know that people respond to different input in different ways, right? So like there isn't one marketing campaign that's going to change. There isn't a silver bullet when it comes to changing people's behavior. And that's unfortunately just the truth. I would say that it's a culture change. So that means it takes sort of constant messaging from lots of directions. So things like this talk and what Clean Lakes Alliance does in combination with what Dane County's saying and Madison is saying, right? What the universities are recommending, what your plant nurseries start to recommend, right? It's that culture change of everybody sort of unifying around a message that eventually gets to culture change. It's also, a lot of people are really swayed by what their neighbors say. It's part of the reason why I talked about my own journey with this, right? Because seeing somebody do it and what it could, like I get told all the time by my family who likes much more cultivated gardens, they don't think they can do native because they don't know how it looks, right? And so by coming to my house and seeing my native gardens, they're like, this is actually really pretty. Can you recommend this plant? Or I really like this plant. What is it? Can I grow this at my house, right? So the change, culture change is both a marketing strategy and just a momentum of people who are doing it and trying it and moving it that direction. And I do think, I would say though, that I think Madison and Dane County both have great initiatives, and I think they have been pretty successful. The leaf free streets initiative, they've been piloting it in a few neighborhoods, and I've seen some early data that suggests they're being really successful in that really local approach. So they initially started with just a few small, couple street by couple street neighborhoods where they really targeted communications and practices. And I've seen some early results from that suggest that was really successful. So grassroots and local is potential, and then growing into more of a bigger movement, I think is maybe one option of ways it could work. Yeah, it's a hard question.
Right. It sounds like it's going to take many entities coming together.
I know. I wish it was a simple answer, but it's not.
Yeah. Well, this is going back to, I think, a follow-up. I'm not sure exactly what Dave initially asked, but he's wondering when it comes, I think he's referring to erosion on our topsoil. What would best be for that? Grasses, layers of leaves, or maybe bark mulch? Those are some options he was giving.
Yeah, that is a good question. I'm trying to think. Usually when we're talking about trying to stop erosion, the best thing is plants. Plants of any kind, but actually turf grass is really bad at stopping erosion because its roots are really shallow. So if you're going to do grasses, pick some of our native grasses. Our native grasses are used to our conditions and they tend to have really deep roots. Plant some prairie grass, that's a great way to stop erosion. Mulch will help. It's better than nothing, but it will not do as much as the plants themselves will do to hold your soil in place. Because remember that they're going to make this big spider web of root systems that actually grabs the soil and makes it really hard to wash out. If that makes sense. So I would encourage planting. And if you don't want to plant, I don't know exactly what your situation looks like, but one of the things I talk a lot about, if you're looking at in rural areas, is planting a buffer, having a nice buffer of restored prairie grasses before you get to your creek or wherever the soil is going, helps you hold the sort of stop the soil and clear the soil out before the water gets to the waterway. If that makes sense.
Great. One final question before I have an additional question for the Clean Lakes folks. This is about the lakes. If you had to pick one thing for an individual to do to make the biggest difference, what would that be?
One thing. Okay, I'm actually gonna give you two because I have two answers to that. One, I think the biggest impact is rain gardens. I really do. They've made the biggest impact in our property in the way that the native plantings I have at my house have done the most good in reducing the water that's capturing around my house. So I think native plantings and native gardens and rain gardens are the best solution. I would say I think the simplest solution, so that's my second answer, the simplest solution that has a really big impact is actually just redirecting your downspouts. Move a downspout. A lot of older homes in particular have downspouts that come right off their garage and go down their driveway. Move that downspout. That's going to have a huge impact on where the water goes at your house on a sort of individually local. So those are my two answers, and they're a little bit different. Simplest with most impact, and I think long-term best impact.
Interesting. And then the final question I have, and this is probably going to be for our Clean Lakes friends, is coming from Mike asking, is this presentation archived online for later viewing? Oh, James, you just need that.
Yeah, Max, this will be on our YouTube channel probably by this afternoon, and we usually try to send it out to attendees as well. So the entire thing will be archived, and you can go back and watch it again and again.
Well, perfect. Just the answers we were looking for. If you do have additional questions we weren't able to get to, though I think we did fly through all the ones that were listed, you can email info@cleanlakesalliance.org, and Adam or James will forward that along to Katie or whoever needs to get that answer for you. Circle Wednesday, December 8th on your calendars. I've marked mine as well. That's the next Science Cafe 101. And that is dealing with 2 student groups from UW-Madison. They'll be presenting their capstone projects to help our lakes get cleaner and healthier. And specifically, one of these projects, and it's kind of interesting, we were talking about it before the seminar, pertains to the John Nolan Causeway and how the reimagining of that project could look, because they have to apparently redo this causeway by 2026. It's sinking, and so they're making it more sustainably friendly as well. So I appreciate everyone so much for starting their mornings off here with the Clean Lakes Alliance. Again, I'm Max Paris. We are proud sponsors, and I will see you next month, Wednesday, December 7th, for our next speakers talking about the John Nolan Project. Again, everyone, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next month. Have a great day.